All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Alice Ollstein. Alice is a reporter for ThinkProgress, which you can find at thinkprogress.org. You can also follow her on Twitter at Alice Ollstein. Alice, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Great to be back.
So, Alice, if you take away all of the news and stories about the candidates themselves, watching the presidential primaries and caucuses, it's pretty abundantly clear that we have some very, very serious problems with the actual process of voting here in the U.S. You've been covering those problems for ThinkProgress in a bunch of different articles and posts. Before we get into kind of the details of individual states and the problems that are in there, I guess first thing I'm going to ask you, give us an overview of the voting problems you've actually seen this election cycle.
I don't even know where to start. There's been so many, and there's so many different kinds of problems. There have been just a wave of laws passed since the Supreme Court struck down the Voting Rights Act in 2013 by governments that are controlled by states that are controlled by Republican governors and legislatures, passing laws that they had wanted to pass before but weren't able to because of the Voting Rights Act. So we saw, in Texas, in North Carolina, in a lot of these states, just right after the Supreme Court ruled, they pushed these bills forward to cut early voting and implement strict voter ID laws, cut polling hours, just many different strategies that in the end have the effect of making it a lot harder for people to vote, especially certain kinds of people who don't have a lot of economic resources, can't travel a long distance, don't have time to fight government bureaucracy to get the documents they need, maybe people with disabilities who have mobility issues. So there's, and students, we've seen so many states where students have had problems voting in this election, and students tend to be more progressive than the rest of the population, and so that could really have an impact both now and going forward.
Well, let's dig into some of the individual states. To me, one of the ones that is, anyone who looks at this has to think that this is crazy. I mean, there are some people who will try to we got to have voter ID because all this fraud, which is a load of BS. Both you and I know that. But one of the most obviously egregious one, pardon me, is what happened in the state of Arizona, where you had some 5-hour plus long lines of people out in the Arizona sun waiting to vote. There's actually been some lawsuits. Tell us about Arizona and the fight for people's right to vote that's going on there.
Absolutely. So in Arizona, there was a heated primary in both the Republican and the Democratic side. And we saw that in one of the most populous counties and one of the most diverse counties in the whole state, which is in Maricopa County where Phoenix is, the local election officials decided that they only needed a tiny fraction of the polling places that were open in the previous election, despite the fact that this has been a record turnout year in all of the states that have voted so far. And it's an election where people who have not been excited about politics are getting excited and getting involved, and so they should have anticipated this high turnout. However, they closed about 2/3 of the available polling places. They went down from about 200 to about 60. And sort of predictably, we saw these immense long lines that you mentioned, and people who, again, the elderly, people who have to get to work, people who can't afford to wait in a 5-hour line, people who have to take care of their kids, all kinds of people, drive up, see those lines, and turn around and give up and don't cast their ballots. And so there are some lawsuits pending now. There was a lawsuit that was aiming to have the results of the election thrown out. Trump and Hillary won big. So there was a lawsuit to have that thrown out and to have a redo. That one was rejected, but there are other lawsuits that are still going on. And I do understand why that one was rejected. I mean, a lot of people did stand in those 5-hour lines and vote, and to have a redo and do that all again would, be harder for those folks and just harder for everyone. It's sort of a lose-lose situation in that respect.
What do you do to the people who were denied the right to vote? And I mean, I agree that people shouldn't have to stand in a 5-hour line again to do it. But then what about the people who were standing and, maybe they got up there and they were, all these other problems, maybe they didn't have the right ID, maybe the registration has been moved. It really is just a horrible lose-lose situation because it's like, those people shouldn't have to go through that again. But also, there are still who knows how many people who were actually literally were denied the right to vote there in Arizona.
Yeah, and there were, like you mentioned, registration issues. There were people who said that their registration was changed without their knowledge and against their will. Some of the same stuff we were hearing out of New York. And so there were just problems all around. So another lawsuit is continuing, and it was filed by the DNC, the Democratic Party, and the Senate candidate who is running against John McCain in November is part of it. And both Hillary and Bernie are supporting the lawsuit, but they are not, plaintiffs in the lawsuit. But they are both adding their support. And that lawsuit would force the Arizona government to explain why they closed those polling places and to, remedy it for the future and make sure that in future elections there are more than enough to accommodate all of the voters without having those crazy lines.
Yeah, what's so crazy about Arizona, too, is, and a lot of these states, is prior to the Supreme Court gutting the Voting Rights Act, they would not have been able to shut down all those precincts because they actually they actually would have had to be pre-clearance from the Department of Justice to say, okay, you can actually bring these down and close a few of these places. And not that they closed a few, they closed more than they kept open, which is insane. But yeah, that's just one of the results of, again, I guess, of a right-wing Supreme Court here.
Yes, and so a really important thing to keep in mind about what the Supreme Court did. So the Justice Department is also investigating now what happened in Arizona, but I think the most important thing for people to keep in mind is that while we still had a fully functioning Voting Rights Act, all of these changes would have been stopped before they went into effect, and now they can only be challenged after they go into effect, after they hurt voters, and they can still be challenged and struck down, but the damage is already done, and the election results, whatever they are what stands. And so you are potentially having elections in many states that are carried out under unconstitutional circumstances, and they can be challenged after the fact, but again, it's over. And so we're having a lot of problems in that respect. In Arizona, another factor that led to the long lines was that it was a closed primary, and people who were registered as independent were not allowed to participate in either party. And a lot of people didn't know that. There wasn't a lot of good education and ways to get the word out about that. And so those people went and stood in line and made the lines longer only to find out that they couldn't vote. And a lot of people are talking now, because of that and because of New York, about the closed primary system and demanding changes. Obviously, opening up the primary would help people like Bernie Sanders, who are attracting a lot of support from independents. But, there's arguments on both sides, and some people say, look, you have to be registered with a party to have a say in who that party sends to the general. So that's an ongoing discussion that is, I think, separate. People are calling closed primaries voter suppression. I think we have to be really careful about what we label voter suppression. And I think that, yes, it does keep some people from participating in certain ways, but I don't think it's the same as 5-hour lines or strict ID laws.
It's not the same, but I think that it kind of depends, right? Like, if it's a state where there are a lot of states where you can actually, on the very day or up to the week before, change your registration, like that. If that, and there's actually education about it. That I think that's not suppression. Like, if you can actually go in that day and say, okay, I want to vote in the Democrat or Republican, and I'm going to change my affiliation that day. I don't believe that's, suppression. But New York, again, blue state New York, it was, friggin', 6 months in advance where people had to, change their affiliation. And what's crazy, I mean, like, I have plenty of friends in New York. If you're a progressive in New York, you're probably working families or green in a lot of ways. I mean, there are a lot of progressive Democrats there too, but you might be registered working families because they're actually a third party that actually, and they have this really cool way of they can endorse Democrats. If there's like a good Democrat, they can be like, okay, we're gonna put them on our ticket, and you can still vote that way. So like, I sort of get it, but I guess I personally kind of lean on the side of letting everybody vote. You know what I mean? It's like, if I can sort of see the argument, but it's like, you know what? Let them vote. I would rather have more people voting than sort of this sort of like, haha, you didn't register with us, you can't vote. I also think it's kind of a dumb politics for both parties. Okay, so in the long run, you sort of get probably the more establishment candidate's going to win in both of these primaries, but it's like, oh, but we but we don't want your vote here in the primary, but we definitely want you to come back and vote for us in November. But just go home now. I just think it's sort of overall sort of a destructive concept. You know what I mean? For if you're a Democrat and you want independence in November, you probably should try to get them to vote for you in the primaries too. You know what I mean?
And I agree with you that we have such a patchwork of laws across the different states in terms of registration. Many states have implemented same-day registration where people can register and be able to participate right when they go to the polls.
Right.
Other states like New York, you have to have decided your party affiliation 6 months in advance or else you're excluded. And so there's no uniform, and with people moving from state to state, it can be really hard to keep track of. We saw Donald Trump's own children did not register in time to participate. Obviously, they are people who are paying attention in this election. They're New York residents. They're very, very invested. And even they were stymied by the restrictive rules there.
Yeah, and I guess, I don't know, it's sort of, obviously the majority of what's going on is in red states with red legislatures and red governors and red Supreme Court justices who are upholding and striking down these laws. But I have to admit, it sort of bugs me, some of the Democrats being fine with this and not making sort of a bigger deal about it. I mean, I guess it's sort of like the big picture of this is that there really needs to be a big conversation and a big massive voter reform, you know what I mean? And something to make it national standards to make it as easy as humanly possible for people to vote,
And I think it is important that we have both remaining Democratic candidates in the primary being very vocal about this, supporting the lawsuit in Arizona. I think that's really important, and I think that parties are only as progressive as their members force them to be. That's always true. And so if, these rules have been in place for a long time. The New York registration restrictions, the complete lack of early voting in New York, for example, that's all been true for a long time, and we're only seeing a big outcry this year about it. And maybe that outcry, if people can sustain it and, shape it productively, can force reforms. I think that's definitely possible, but I don't think people should sit back and say, oh, I hope the party does this or that. They're only going to do what they're forced to do.